So I thought we'd start with Mr. Robinette.
Well, do you want me to go over the same story that I told you?
Yes, please.
Well, this happened while he was treasurer of the Law Society, and there had been an episode in court the previous week when the judge, Mr. Justice Wilson, had reprimanded a lawyer named Elliot Pepper, who occupied the position of Queen's Proctor, for, as the judge thought, not properly discharging his duties in a divorce action that was before him. And when this came public, it was in the headlines, and at convocation the following Friday, there was a good deal of discussion. There was a motion to reprimand the judge for the way he had treated the Queen's Proctor. And there was a discussion about whether we had the power to do this. And anyway, the debate raged for a bit, and then they took the vote, and it came out a tie vote, so that the treasurer had to cast the deciding vote. And after thinking a bit about it, he voted in favor of the motion of reprimand. And when he got home, there was a telephone message from Chief Justice McClure to come at once to his house, which he did. And John told me afterwards that he never got such a reprimand as he did then from the Chief Justice for interfering in the judiciary in a matter that was none of our concern.
Right.
Just an example of the life of a treasurer.
Yes. So Mr. Robinette was the treasurer when you first became a bencher?
Yes.
Yes. And
Well,
did you know him before
oh
that?
yes. I had known him from way back. In fact, there's an episode in his life which is not very well known. That is that he was appointed a judge, and he was to be sworn in on a certain date. But he came amongst other people to talk to my senior partner, Thomas Phelan, and others who were senior to him, but for whom he had respect. And after talking to them, he decided he was not going to be a judge. So he declined to be sworn in, and he never did become a judge. But there was then a motion made before Chief Justice McClure again to determine whether he was still a bencher, having been appointed a judge, but having declined the appointment. And McClure said he was no longer a bencher. So
Right.
they had to reappoint him as a bencher
Right.
to put him back in good standing. Just one of the episodes in his life. But he was an outstanding lawyer, and as you perhaps have heard, he defended in the Evelyn Dick murder case.
Yes.
He defended her, and he was a son, of course, of the T.C. Robinette that had been a partner of the firm of Robinette, Godfrey and Phelan. And that's about it.
Right. So did you know him socially as well?
Not socially, no.
Not socially.
I knew his family, but we didn't have social contact.
Right. And how old would he have been when you became a bencher, when he was
He would have been
treasurer?
about late 50s, early 60s.
Right.
Yeah.
And how much longer did he remain?
He stayed on as
bencher?
treasurer while I was first a bencher for about, I think his total term was 6 years, and I think I came along in his first year, so it was
Right.
about 5 years treasurer while I was a bencher.
And after he was treasurer, he went back
I
to
should
being a bencher.
add something else.
Yes.
Every convocation day, the benchers have lunch at Osgood Hall. And when John Robinette was treasurer, he used to rather be entertaining in his address to the benchers. And at this time, Joe Sedgwick and Peter Wright had gone to England with and were to go into the convent mainly. And part of their project was to purchase wine for the Law Society. And they used to send regular reports back to John Robinette as treasurer, which he would read out at each bench's luncheon, which were very entertaining.
Okay, so that's about as much as you recall
Well,
about
these are things that
Robinette.
Joe Sedgwick, he was a most eloquent man, and one of the stories he told about himself was that in World War I, he was at the lowest rank that you could serve when in the spring of 1915, the British battle cruiser, the Hampshire, was sunk off Scapa Flow, and amongst those that were lost was Lord Kitchener, who was the head of the Allied
Yes.
troops. So when this happened, Joe Sedgwick wrote a letter home to his mother. And he said, since Lord Kitchener's been lost at Scapa Flow, we've all moved up one rank and I'm now a Lance Corporal.
So he followed John Robinette, Joseph Sedgwick. Do you remember any change in convocation with Mr. Sedgwick?
The only thing that I'll tell you, the only interesting episode that when John Robinette retired, John Arnott was going to run for treasurer, and Sedgwick also, so they finally entered into an agreement whereby Arnott would stand aside, Sedgwick would be elected treasurer, but only for one term.
Right.
But when the one term was expiring, Sedgwick had forgotten about this arrangement. And Arnott had some problem. He had to get others to back up his memory of the events. So that Sedgwick did back down.
Right.
John Arnott did succeed him.
Right. But Joe Sedgwick never became treasurer again. So
No.
how did they reach that arrangement that he would agree to do it just for a short period of time?
Well, he said to John Arnott, this is when they were succeeding Robinette,
Yes.
instead of them both running,
Yes.
he said he would not run, but Arnott would for the
Right.
term. And then, at least the other way around, Arnott would not run, he would. He'd be elected as the only candidate.
Right.
And then the following year, when the vacancy occurred, he could run again or he could drop out.
Right.
And he had agreed to drop out, but he didn't.
Right.
So they had to persuade him to drop.
Right.
And Arnott was elected.
Right. So, with Mr. Arnott then, do you remember when he became treasurer?
Yes,
Yes.
he became treasurer about, it was in 1962.
Right.
And he served for 2 years, or 3 years, I'm not sure which one. But I succeeded him
Right.
for 2 years.
Right.
And then I think Howland, or else Arthur Martin, one of the other.
Mr. Howland after that.
Yeah,
Yes. Yes.
That's right. And then you have Goldwyn Martin, it was G. Arthur Martin. He was called Arthur Martin, not Goldwyn.
Okay.
And he succeeded Howland, a very capable criminal defense lawyer.
When you succeeded John Arnott, did you have to work fairly closely with him initially, once you took over?
What happened was John Arnott said, come over to my office and I'll give you a box of documents that you'll
Right.
find useful. And I went to his office and he had kept good notes for his work, and he says, you'll find all that you need to this box and you take it with you.
Right.
So I did, and that was all that happened.
And that was it. Was that the usual practice? That
Well, I don't know. When I turned it over to Howland, there was no such box.
Right. Right. And then you were actually treasurer a second time, so in 1983.
Well, that was because John Bowlby had been, then he was the treasurer, and in March of that year, he was appointed a judge, which created a vacancy.
Right.
And they elected me again as treasurer to fill the vacancy until the next regular election, which was in June,
Right.
when Laura Legg was
Right.
elected, so I only served for 3 months.
Right. Oh,
But
just
that
a
was the
short
second
time.
term.
Mm. And was that disruptive at all to convocation? Just have a
Well, no,
short...
but I should say that John Bowlby's term of office tended to be a bit disruptive because he and Ken Jarvis did not get on at all.
Right.
And
Secretary. Yes.
Bowlby was inclined to do things his own way, and one of the things he did, he took a trip to Hong Kong, in which he said there was some Law Society business involved that nobody else knew about it but him.
Right.
He got the Law Society to pay for his trip to Hong Kong. Anyway, these are things that John Bowlby was the only treasurer who had any sort of problems with the secretary.
Right. And this was Mr. Jarvis. Okay, well, returning to our list then, Mr. Robbins, Sydney Robbins.
Sidney Robbins?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Sidney Robbins plays an important part in the affairs of the Law Society because while he was treasurer and later on as a judge, he was instrumental in getting legislation passed to permit the collection of money derived from interest on trust accounts. And this created a huge capital sum, and they created an organization to which this money would be paid, the Law Foundation it was called.
Yes.
And that money was distributed for libraries and legal aid and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And John used to, Sidney Robbins was largely responsible for that movement,
Right.
the creation of that fund.
Was that because he was treasurer, or was that because that was something he was personally interested in?
Well, the matter had been discussed on numerous occasions up to that time, but nothing much had happened, and he decided to
Right.
make it move, and he did.
Right.
So,
Right.
and Sidney Robbins, as you perhaps know, became a judge, and he's now retired as a judge, and he's back attending convocation. Takes an active interest in it.
Okay. Stuart Tom.
Well, Stuart Tom was a good, steady, hard-working treasurer. He did his work well, and I don't recall anything. Oh yes, there was one thing he was took an interest in. The Law Society, as you perhaps know, has an iron fence around Osgood Hall property.
Yes.
And it had fallen into disrepair. In fact, the city of Toronto had decided to expropriate 10 feet of land along Queen Street to widen Queen Street, which would have torn down the fence for that 10 feet depth. And the Law Society decided not to do any repairs until this had happened. But the city then decided not to expropriate the 10 feet. And this fence still needed repairs, so there was a spirited debate as to whether it should be repaired or not. And I was in favor of repairing it, as was Barry Pepper, but Stuart Tom was not. And the debate was waxing strong. And then one of those opposed to repairing the fences, Elmer Sofa of Sudbury. And Elmer Sofa got up and made a spirited speech saying how nice it would be to see mothers and children having their picnics on the front lawn. And that swung the vote right around. So the fence was repaired at considerable cost because the repair side won the debate.
And do you have any idea why Stuart Tom opposed the fence? Was it the cost,
Well,
or was it
he
another reason?
it was the cost, and he had not quite the same view of picnics on the lawn that Sophie
Right.
had, but he thought that the public access to the grounds
Yes.
would be enhanced if we didn't repair the fence.
Right. Was security ever an issue, like
No.
in terms of the fence? So it was
No,
more
but
just.
nobody ever. Well, the fence, the gates. It has been said that there were cow gates to keep cows off
Yes, I've
the
heard
front of the Law Society property, but others have said that that was only a sort of a funny story, that the real reason was security, because they have, if you look at them, they can be folded shut and locked
that. Yes.
for security if that
Yes.
became necessary.
Right.
And I think the only occasion when it ever might have happened, there was a slave escaped from the United States to Upper Canada. And the question of, the United States sought to extradite him back to the United States. And the spirited debate arose in convocation, and there was threats that people would break into Osgood Hall to
Right.
release the slave.
Right.
But in fact, the court finally ruled that he would go back to the United States, but somehow or other they got it before the Privy Council in London, who reversed convocations, at least the trial judge's order, and he was transferred to England.
Right.
And whether this was a worse fate than slavery, I don't know, but in England they sent him to Liberia,
Oh.
which was meant to be a colony for escaped
Yes.
slaves.
Yes.
That's where he ended up.
And do you know what year this would have been, or
About the 1850s or 60s, somewhere in there.
Right. And you don't remember the man's name?
There's a book written about it,
Yes.
and it's written in the law reports too, but at the moment I don't remember.
Right. So Mr. Gray, so we just looked at Stuart Tom, Mr. Gray, George Finlayson.
Well, of course, he's still around and takes an active part, and he has been a treasurer, he's been a judge, he's a retired judge now, still comes to convocation, recently wrote the biography of John Robinette, and still takes an active part in the Law Society affairs.
Yes. And he was followed by John Bowlby. You talked about him briefly before.
Well, John Bowlby, as I tell you, he was appointed judge in the spring of the year that I served a second time. And he didn't serve long as a judge, and he died. So that ended his career in law. And he had a belief that he was sort of impregnable. He used to actually go out for a run, five miles every morning.
Mm.
And apparently he destroyed the cartilages in his knees,
Yes.
which really made him immobile. But he died shortly afterwards.
Right. And you said that he had a personality conflict with Ken Jarvis.
Yes.
What was that based on?
Well, because Ken Jarvis, first of all, gave him instructions as to what he should do if he was spending money, like how to send in a voucher for his expenditures and so on.
Right.
And he simply tore it up and said he'd do it his way.
Oh, right.
He didn't like being told how to do things by Ken Jarvis.
Although that probably was Ken Jarvis's job to do that, was it?
Well, Ken was doing the right thing. He should have.
He was the secretary, and that was
But
his job.
the belief afterwards was that Bowlby spent a lot of Law Society money unjustifiably.
Right. And so you took a short term after him to fill in
Well,
his...
I filled in from his
Yes.
appointment as a judge
And then
until
Laura
Laura Legg came in this June of that year.
Okay, and so she was the first, she was the first woman bencher and then the first woman treasurer. Do you remember anything about that occasion? Was that something that was notable to...
I don't remember anything notable. I don't know. Mrs. Elliot came in later on,
Yes,
second
yes.
treasurer, female. But Laura Legg did a good job and was very popular.
But you don't remember anything being remarked upon the fact that she was the first woman treasurer? Was there was a lot of media, I know about it. In Convocation itself, was that something that was noted at the time?
There was that in itself was never a subject for discussion.
Yes. Okay.
But she commanded the respect of everybody.
Yes. And she had been a bencher for some years at that point.
Yes.
And she was followed in 1985 by Pierre Genet, who was the first Francophone treasurer. Go ahead, sorry.
Pierre Genet was an extremely able counsel and treasurer, but he suffered a stroke while as treasurer, and for a while his work was taken over by Arthur Skase, who was next in line, and then what's his name again?
William Chilcott?
No.
After office, Pierre Genet.
Pierre Genet came back again, and then he had a second, more serious stroke, and that ended his career.
Yes.
He died shortly afterwards.
And do you remember anything about Pierre Genet while he was treasurer?
Well, he was capable, he was witty, and he did things in a very businesslike way. I don't remember anything in particular.
And so Arthur Skase basically picked up that last year, the 86 to 1987. That would have been Pierre Genet's year.
Well, I think Arthur Skase succeeded him then when he died.
Right. And then he was followed by William Chilcott.
Well, I don't remember Chilcott at all as a bencher.
Right.
At least as a treasurer. He was only the treasurer for a short time, and
yes.
he became a judge.
Right.
And I don't remember anything about his term of office.
Okay. What about Lee Ferrier, who followed him?
The same with him.
Right.
Well, I'll tell you one thing about Lee Ferrier. In fact, I reminded him of this the other day. When he was treasurer, the women benchers had not been assigned a room of their own for meeting and putting their clothing and things like that, but there was a room that the previous treasurer, Cyril Carson, for ex-treasurers only, which had lockers in it, and a lounge, and it was called the ex-treasurer's room. So Ferrier said, because he was looking for a room for the women, he said to us ex-benchers, ex-treasurers, if you surrender this room for the women benchers, we'll provide you with another one. We never got it.
You never got it.
I was reminding him of this the other day, and he just
You're
laughed.
still waiting.
Yeah.
So that was in the late 1980s.
Yes,
So how many women would there have been then?
there would have been half a dozen.
Right, so enough that they needed
They
their
needed
own.
a meeting place.
Yes. And Lee Ferrier was followed by James Spence in 1990.
Yes. Nothing notable about that.
Okay. Alan Rock after that.
Who was left for that?
Alan Rock.
Oh yes, Alan Locke. Well, he served. In fact, he was back the other day. He's now serving as Canada's representative in the United Nations. He was a judge, but he was a good treasurer. I don't remember anything in particular.
There was recently an unveiling of his portrait.
Pardon?
An unveiling of his portrait recently.
He was back for that the other day.
Yes.
It's funny, my wife went to a dinner when I was treasurer, and she found herself seated between one lawyer named John Ground and Alan Rock on the other, and she said she was between a rock and a hard place.
Okay, what about the remaining people we have? So we're up to 1993. We have Paul Lamech. Do you remember?
Paul Lamech died, as you perhaps know, shortly after his term of office, and he suffered some illness which required the amputation of his left leg below the knee. And at his funeral, the former treasurer gave the eulogy, Harvey Strasberg, and it was quite, for a funeral, it was quite entertaining. He said that after his surgery, when the lower part of the left leg was removed, somebody asked him how tall he was, and he said 5'11" on the right side, left side a foot shorter. Anyway, he died.
And he was followed by Eleanor Elliott, who was the second female treasurer that the Law Societies had.
Yes.
Again, was that notable at all?
Pardon?
Was that in any way notable to?
No, I don't remember anything special.
Okay. And you just mentioned Harvey Strasberg.
Well, Harvey Strasberg was notable in one important way. Before he became treasurer, the Law Society Errors and Omissions Insurance Fund had become bankrupt almost. It was a real disaster facing the Law Society. And Harvey Strasberg took that in hand and reorganized the Law Society Insurance Fund, and it's now been working fine ever since.
So that was that in his capacity as a treasurer?
Yes,
or,
well,
yes.
as treasurer, but he also put others in charge, sort of under him, but he dominated the thing, and he saw to it that we didn't go and meet disaster.
Yes. And Robert Armstrong?
Well, he
after
was
that?
treasurer for only a short time, and became a judge, and still is. And Vern Krishna, I've always admired him for two reasons. Well, he was an extremely capable person, but he had the clearest, most distinct voice of anybody in the law system.
Mm-hmm.
And he spoke, he enunciated well, but he articulated well. He could really speak well. And he did a great job as treasurer. And Frank Morocco, of course, is the present treasurer, and he's a much different person from Vern Krishna. He's soft-spoken and doesn't say too much.
Could you comment then generally, picking up the difference between those two treasurers that you've just mentioned, their personalities and so forth?
Well, do you mean Morocco and Krishna?
Yeah, I'm thinking more generally about treasurers, the impact that the different personalities had on convocation? Could
Well,
you make any
as
comment?
I've told you, when
Yes.
John Bowlby was treasurer, there was frequent conflict, and it was very unpleasant. And that didn't end until he'd been appointed to the bench. Now, there's never been another episode like that, but when Lamech was treasurer, he became ill, and Strasbourg, as I say, gave the eulogy at his funeral, which was very notable. But I don't remember anything in particular about the others of that period, except Vern Krishna. Vern Krishna was in a class all by himself, and you never had any doubt what he was saying or what he was trying to explain.
You've mentioned at least two initiatives that former treasurers took in hand, Harvey Strasbourg and the insurance fund,
Yes.
and the other was the interest on trust accounts under
Well, that was
Robbins.
John Robbins.
Yes. So what impact would you say individual treasurers had in initiating important changes such as those? Can you think of anything else that...
Well, I don't think there's anything else of a singular nature that where the treasurer took something in hand, but I know that Vern Krishna did a great job as treasurer.
Yes. Now, the one person we haven't talked about is you as treasurer.
Well,
So you were treasurer twice, once briefly and once for a full term.
well, there were no crisis of any sort on either occasion, and I had no difficulties carrying out my duties as treasurer. Ken Jarvis, of course, was the secretary at that time, and he did most of the... You asked earlier about the duties of the secretaries, Jarvis and Earl Smith, but they really ran the office, and
Right.
no treasurer could do his work very well unless he had a very capable secretary
Yes.
to arrange meetings and so on,
Yes.
things like that. And I think we had a few visitors while I was treasurer. One of them, I think, if my memory serves me correctly, was as a visitor we had the Chief Justice of the United States, Earl Warren. He gave him an honorary degree,
All right.
and for the honorary degree they have a special scarlet robe that they put on him,
Right.
which was used on this occasion. And when he went home, he took it with him, which he wasn't meant.
Did you return it?
No, it's never been.
It's never come back. So, no particular initiatives that you can think of while you were treasurer in the 2-year period, 66 to 68? Anything notable?
I don't remember. I'm just trying to think if anything was. Nothing comes to mind.
So, could you perhaps talk briefly about what your work as treasurer involved? How many hours would you have
Well,
been involved in?
it involved attending at least once every day to the treasurer's office in Osgood Hall, where papers were left by the secretary for your attention.
Right, so you had your own office.
And you'd have to look after that. sometimes you'd be there practically all day looking after things, other times it'd be very brief.
Right.
But you were there part of every day.
Right.
And the treasurer, as a result, although when I was first treasurer, he did not get paid, but now the treasurer does.
Yes.
And when I was treasurer the second time, I was greatly surprised to get paid for
Right.
3 months, whatever it was.
Right. While you were treasurer, did you need to cut back on your other work at the office? Was that something that generally happened to treasurers?
Yes. I used to, well, I was cutting back on my office work at that time anyway, so I hadn't retired yet. But it did, to a certain extent, cut back on your office work.
Yes.
But I think, although I'd have to check the records to be sure I'm right on this, that I actually did legal work for the Law Society when I was
Right.
treasurer.
Right.
Appeared in Supreme Court of Canada, for example,
Right.
that sort of thing.
And other than the administrative work, I imagine there would have been a lot of social engagements involved in being a
Yes.
treasurer. So
Well, one of the most frequent was when a new judge was appointed, you'd have to appear
right.
when he was sworn in and make a speech and welcome
Right.
and so on. And it was mostly boring stuff.
And I imagine there would have been dinners and functions like that as well,
Well,
or less of those.
I'm sure there were functions that I attended as treasurer that I don't recall any in particular.
Right. What, how did you come to be a bencher in the first place? What drove you to?
Well, I had run for bencher but not been elected, but I was close
Right.
behind the
And when
last
was
one.
that?
And then shortly after there was a vacancy when a bencher was appointed a judge,
Right.
and I was elected to fill that vacancy.
Right.
I became a bencher and ruled, and then when I was treasurer, I no longer had to run for bencher because ex-treasurers are life benchers.
Yes.
So that's what I still am.
Right. Right. And your duties as a bencher, you attend convocation monthly.
Usually.
Right.
Not always, but mostly.
Right. And you've been involved in a lot of committee work?
A lot of what?
Committee work.
No. I've not done much committee work.
Right.
In recent years anyway.
Right.
I'm now 95 years of
Yes.
age. I feel I've done my bit.
Yes. So, when you decided that you were interested in becoming a bencher, what drove you to do that other than
Well,
vacancy?
I don't remember, but I know Bob Rutherford was my partner. And we discussed it. He was my campaign manager.
Right.
Organized the campaign, and he looked after when I nearly got elected, but not quite. And then within 2 years, I was a bencher by reason of filling the vacancy, so that
Yes.
ended the doubt.
And what did the campaign involve? Was it just
Well, he had to, I guess, write letters to people he knew to
right,
stir interest in the election and
right,
get them to vote for me.
right?
So,
Would you say you were fairly well known in the legal community?
well,
at that
I had
time?
the advantage over others in that I had been a lecturer in the law school,
Yes.
and I'd also lectured in the bar admission course,
Yes.
which gave me, I guess, a decided advantage over most people running for
Right.
bencher.
Right. And you had at that point, in any case, been practicing for, I'm trying to think,
Well,
calculations,
32
years? Yes.
was when I started to practice law.
Yes.
So that I've been at
So
that.
25 years. Yes. Yes. So, yeah. You'd already had a substantial legal career at that point, yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. We were talking earlier about Terry Sheard.
Yes.
Yes, you mentioned
Yes.
him. Could you go back to what you were saying about that earlier before we started?
Well, Terry Sheard was an extremely bright, witty, capable lawyer who did mostly wills and estates work.
Right.
And I think I told you already the episode where he came into the library and asked Barry Pepper if he could understand how Oliver Cromwell had defeated the whole of England, Ireland, Scotland and Wales with only 3,000 Roundheads, and when Barry expressed ignorance of the answer, he said, well, I'll tell you, every man jack of them was a James Chalmers McClure, and McClure, of course, was the Chief Justice, who was and always seemed to be extremely unpopular. One of the stories about McClure that I remember was at a bencher's dinner. Arthur Maloney was speaking. Arthur Maloney had defended one of the last two people to be hanged in Ontario, and Chief Justice McClure had presided over the trial.
Right.
But in his speech, Arthur Maloney said that he had been requested to defend this man by James Chalmers McClure, that great humanitarian as he then was not. Of course, not only did he asked Maloney to defend the man, but then hanged.
Yes.
So, quite a sad story.
Now, you mentioned that a number of the former treasurers became judges and left the convocation and then came back subsequently.
That's right. Well, Sidney Robbins is an example,
Yes.
and George Finley's another one,
Right.
and I guess there's others. And Gib Gray, he died just recently, but he had been treasurer and then a judge and then came back, but he didn't live very, he died quite suddenly recently.
Right. So that's obviously a common pattern, that movement.
Well, it was, except that some people, including, for example, me and Laura Legg, never did become judges. And
Yes.
in fact, this is another Terry Sheard story. While I was treasurer the first time, we had as our luncheon guest Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was then Minister of Justice. This was before he became
Yes.
Prime Minister of Canada. And we called him to the bar in Osgoode Hall, and then we walked out onto the Civic Square and up to the courthouse, where he was sworn in as a solicitor. And as we walked up from the Osgoode Hall to the courthouse, I was on one side of Trudeau and Sheard on the other, and then the other bench was all behind us. And Sheard said, "Trudeau," he said, "there's one thing that distinguishes O'Brien and me from those 40-odd fellows behind us." And Trudeau said, "What's that, Mr. Sheard?" And he says, "Neither one of us wants to be a judge." Which,
So that was never an ambition for you?
no.
No. Now, in the time that you were treasurer, they introduced lay benchers.
Yeah, well, yes.
Yes. Could you comment on that, your perception of that, how that changed convocation?
Well, it didn't change it at all.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, we're most fortunate in the choice of people to serve as lay benchers. You've had excellent selections and still do. And I noticed you have one of them on there,
Regina Tate.
well, Regina Tate and,
Oh, June Corwood.
pardon?
June Corwood.
Yeah, June Colwood, that's the other one, too.
Do
But
you,
we've had other excellent ones.
do you have any memories of either of those, Regina Tate or June Corwood, while they have been lay benchers? Do you remember anything in particular about?
No,
No.
no.
Okay. The other question I wanted to ask you was, you've been in convocation now for over 40 years,
Yes.
and do you have any perception of it change the tone? Is it less formal now, perhaps, than it was? Anything like that? Any changes of that sort over that period of time?
Tell you one anecdote about it. When I was first a bencher, convocation was on Friday, not Thursday, as it now is. And at that time, in the Catholic Church, you're not meant to eat meat on Friday.
Right.
And the result is that the Law Society served fish at convocation on Friday. And then the church dropped this prohibition on eating meat on Friday. So Earl Smith phoned me, and he said, I've spoken to Arthur Maloney, he would have no objection if we stopped serving fish. And I just want to be sure you wouldn't. And I said, not at all. So the next Friday, in convocation, there was no fish. Isn't Earl of Winter was outraged. He said it was the one thing he looked forward to for convocation, was the fish.
Was that, yes.
But the convocation used to, as I say, just to give you an example of how things have changed, it started at 11 o'clock on Friday morning,
Right,
never went beyond lunch.
right,
There were no written reports of committees, they were all delivered orally.
right.
So, let's see who that is. Maybe it's here from me. But, as I say, convocation never went beyond lunch, 2 hours, as opposed to starting now at 9 o'clock and often going as late as 5 o'clock.
Yes. Is there simply more business now to attend to?
Well, it's due to a sort of a, I don't know how to describe it, but people they don't understand how to be concise anymore. I know that when I last appeared in the Supreme Court of Canada, the court had limited argument time to, I think it was 10 minutes to present your argument.
Yes,
I found that ample time to present any argument.
yes,
But there's some people who are quite incapable of being concise.
yes,
There's a woman at the last convocation who was asked to make a report, which was all in writing. Everybody could have read it anyway.
yes,
But she went on for about half an hour to an hour presenting this report. Now, why, I don't know, except it's a sign of the times. People like to talk too much,
right,
and that makes convocation much more lengthy than it need be. I spoke to the treasurer about it, and I spoke to Vern Krishna, and he agreed with me that we should have a time limit on presentation.
right, yes,
So, make it shorter, but that hasn't been really proposed yet, but it should come, I think.
right. So, other than the length and the date, is it less formal than it used to be? I understand that the clothing was different. In an
Well,
earlier time.
we don't gown except one day of the year, and it was always the same in that respect.
Right,
I think we used to gown for the call of the bar ceremonies in
right,
June or May, Now they've changed the call to the bar ceremonies to a different period of time, and they don't take place in Toronto anymore, or at least they do. One in London, one in Ottawa, so that there's no the call of the bar now comes once, I forget what the occasion is even, but it's just a tradition.
Yes. And there are no other differences that you can think of between now and when you first became a bencher? Same room, there are more people.
I'm sure there are differences. I know that I can remember somewhere in the last 20 years they started serving. We used to get sherry served before lunch, but nothing else.
Mm.
Then they served any kind of drink you wanted,
Right.
which is a change. And I don't think there's much significant change.
Now, some of these people that we were talking about earlier, you would have known for a very long time and worked with them for a very long time as a bencher. You must have formed some close friendships over that time. Could you talk about any of those people in particular, not necessarily the ones we mentioned, but perhaps other ones that we didn't talk about?
Well, let's look over the list here. I would say all on this list here. Have you got the same list I have?
Yes, all of the treasurers, yes.
But for example, Barry Pepper, I was very close to him while I was a treasurer, at least a bencher. And Laura Legg, and John Arnott, and William Howland. And you have his name Wesley, Gib Gray, we called him Gibson Gray.
Right.
I was very close to him.
Did you find that you had the same interests, that you served on perhaps the same committees?
Pardon?
Did you serve on the same committees? Did you have the same kinds of interests?
Well, when I did serve on committees, which I've ceased to do, I found I served on 3 different committees at a time usually, and there'd be different people on each committee.
Right.
Yeah. I always remember there was a bencher, he has since died many years ago, Gordon Ford. And Gordon Ford had a habit of talking too much. And he was on a discipline committee hearing that I was on. And G. Arthur Martin, who's on your list, was the chairman of the committee. It was a rather complex case. And the lawyer that was being disciplined was giving evidence. And Arthur Martin decided he wanted to ask him a question. And he decided to write out the question. It was a very complex case.
Right.
He wrote the question out exactly as he wanted to put it. And he said, I want to put this question to you. And had he no sooner put it out than Gordon Ford said, what the treasurer meant to ask you was this. That was the way Gordon Ford was.
Well, Mr. O'Brien, I think we've come to the end of the people that I wanted to ask you about today. Is there anybody else you can think of or anything else that you'd like to add before we
I don't
finished
think so.
anything
I
that
think you've
covered?
covered all this pretty well. So I don't know that there's much else that we should be reviewing, but if you have any other subject matter, I'm prepared to devote more time to it. But
Sure, I think that we'll finish here for today, so thank you very much.
well, that's